Arcane was an amazing show. It won awards, changed the industry, and was way ahead of its time. Arcane exploded onto the scene, moving beyond the League audience and introducing the world of Runeterra to a whole new group of people. However, did you know that in the beginning, Arcane wasn't even meant to become the new canon for Runeterra? That only happened because of its massive success. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshines and rainbows, since Arcane kinda messed a lot of things up in Runeterra. You can basically divide the lore into pre- and post-Arcane, which is what I've done here. We'll go region by region, and in each region, we'll talk about a few characters. Alright, I want to start with the most obvious ones, which are the cities in which Arcane takes place. Let's kick things off by talking about Piltover. Basically, all of Piltover's characters were redefined by Arcane in a way that many consider positive, but there are some champions who were completely forgotten, such as the most important one, Camille.
Tell me, is it the third arm that makes you extra glorious?
To sum it up, before Arcane, Hextech worked in a completely different way. Hextech crystals were harvested from a species called the Brackern, which used to be Skarner's species. Skarner's a League champion who recently got a rework. Pre-Arcane, Camille's family sought out these creatures and collected their crystals. With Skarner's rework and Arcane becoming the new canon, nothing about Camille makes sense. Not to mention the fact that her role in Piltover's dynamic is pretty similar to Caitlyn and Mbessa's in Arcane. Camille's literally in limbo now. After the Arcane changes, Camille became a champion who basically doesn't exist. Her mostly robotic body, something that was only possible thanks to Hextech crystals and Hextech technology in general, was no longer a part of the lore, since Jason Victor invented it without any involvement from Camille or her clan, the Furros clan. Some people even tried to spot Arcane's Camille at the Powerful Families gathering, but when the season ended, there was nothing. Literally no mention of Camille or her clan. Alright, moving on. Let's talk about Orianna.
The ball is angry.
She appeared at the end of Arcane, showing us that she's Singe's daughter, and that she'd been kinda dead for a while, meaning that everything Singe did was about finding a way to bring her back. The thing is, in Orianna's original story, there's a crucial, fundamental component that we don't see at any point in Arcane. The fact that Orianna performed surgery on her own father to give him her heart. This is after she practically became a robot herself. It might seem like a silly or minor thing, but this is an essential element of Orianna's lore, and all three of her fans who knew the lore were genuinely upset about it. Unfortunately, adapting her current story doesn't seem like the best solution, which means Orianna's story basically has to be completely rewritten thanks to Arcane. And finally, in Piltover, we have Seraphine.
Couldn't lose a rhythm if I tried.
She basically has no reason to exist in the current lore. As I said, in the old lore, Hextech crystals came from the Brackern, and within those crystals were the souls of the Brackern. And this is what connects Seraphine to her empathetic powers and amplifies that same power, making her super good at music. And although the Legends of Runeterra game brought a top-notch update to her story, that update doesn't cover what Arcane undid. That's because, as I said, Hextech crystals came from the Brackern, and with that, most of her story's foundation just vanishes. Besides, in her story, Zon and Piltover are already divided and have been considered two cities for a long time. The way this could be maintained is by turning Seraphine into a child, which would definitely mess with a good part of her concept of being an artist who wants to use her music to unite Piltover and Zon. So the champs all messed up. It was already sketchy, but now? My goodness. But anyway, that wraps up Piltover. And this is where things start to get complicated because Arcane touched on several characters linked to Zon, but didn't cover all of them. And the characters who weren't covered fell into a narrative limbo with completely disconnected stories. And the thing is, even Zon's own story, the city's story itself, was heavily modified. Zon in Arcane is like a neighborhood of Piltover that has its own identity, but seeks independence, like a district that wants to be recognized as a city. However, in the old League lore, that had already happened a long time ago. Alright, let's start with Blitzcrank. Victor has a voice line regarding him, but since we didn't see anything about him in Arcane, his latest story doesn't make much sense. It's basically Blitz being a super simple golem that Victor found one day and started messing with using a Hextech crystal. Victor, by the way, before Arcane, was a scholar and apprentice of Singed. At no point is there any mention of a robot like Blitz, and even then, that Hextech crystal wouldn't be discovered until much later. And to make matters even worse, the old Victor followed the orders of a Kim Baron, which complicates adapting the story to to Arcane even more, since these elements are completely out of sync. And to finalize Blitz's lore, Victor returns to his lab to destroy the robot under the Cambaran's orders. But when he gets there, Blitz is already gone, having left the lab to live as a patrolman in the Undercity. In the old story, Blitz was just a simple robot, and what made him become something more was Victor's Hextech crystal. And the reason this happened was because of the way that the Hextech crystals used to work, the whole Brackern thing and all. While this was never said clearly, if you combine the information about Seraphine hearing the Brackern souls with the fact that Blitz practically acquired consciousness and individuality because of this crystal, it's likely that these Brackern souls had some connection to this emergence of identity. In other words, Blitz lore is messed up. However, the fact that Victor has a line for him might mean that this new story already exists and keeps Blitz as his creation. By the way, I could talk about how problematic it is that Blitz and Echo fight in the slump against some grunts at some point, but I'll get to Echo later. Before that, I want to talk about Dr. Mundo.
Mundo's pain always at 0.
This one's less complicated than the others because Mundo's story doesn't directly involve anyone but himself. The only problem is that Mundo seems to have been supercharged by Shimmer. Even the device he carries on his arm that injects him looks a bit like Warwick. And the problem here is thinking about who besides Singed would have had the knowledge and skill with Shimmer to achieve this level of mutation and result. Part of this would be easy to attribute to Singed himself, maybe something he did before Vander, or maybe even after, once he had already perfected the process and is perhaps trying to improve it even further to save his daughter, but we can't really tell. It's possible that Mundo's updated story doesn't conflict with any other story, mainly because he no longer mentions any other characters, but that might be a problem for fans, as it puts Mundo in a zone where he doesn't need any attention, and he's just kinda abandoned there, which isn't very pleasant. Let's go then to the big boy, Echo.
Every second matters.
He appeared a lot in Arcane, and he's even a fan favorite character, despite having at least 3 different stories. The first one was what we saw in Arcane, where he's an orphan who just has a lot of affection and appreciation for Benzo as a parental figure. In the second story, the original, he loses a friend named Ajuna, which was very important for his character formation and his understanding that he won't always be able to rewind time and have a new chance. The third story comes from the game Convergence, which showed that Arcane was one of the main lines of the Runeterra multiverse, which, if you remember, was Arcane's initial proposal to tell a good story, simplifying character details, and not worrying so much about their connection to the rest of the world. As if it wasn't enough, Arcane also presents us with a 4th timeline where Echo is happy alongside with Jinx. His friends are alive and everything is so beautiful that at the end of it, fans' hearts were completely shattered. In this timeline, Jinx wasn't so crazy, and the two were finally a couple, making the Time Bomb shippers super happy. And if Riot didn't want to explore alternative realities, they created a massive headache, because this story really caught the fans' attention. Alright, enough about Echo, let's talk about Janna.
The Tempest is at your command.
Although Janna had a brief cameo in Arcane, part of her story urgently needs to be rewritten, as her importance to Piltover and Zaun is related to something Arcane didn't even touch on, most likely because it didn't happen yet. What I'm talking about is the disaster that happened in the River Pilt during the time that the Sun Gates were being created. It's because of this disaster that the division and segregation between Piltoverans and Zaunites intensified. During this crisis, Janna plays an essential role in Zaun's survival, this being perhaps the main reason why she became such an important entity/divinity for the Zaunites. It's no wonder that her cameo is basically Jinx talking about her, how she was considered a goddess and all, and that people would believe anything. Moving on, we have Renata Glass.
Zaun deserves more.
She's basically Silco in high heels. This is so true that even the writers revealed information confirming it. But the big problem with her and Silco existing are some details that the two carry at their core as characters, especially due to the fact that they're roughly similar in age and have conflicting chronologies. Let's start with the fact that Renata is the daughter of a couple of alchemists who supposedly invented a chemtech formula that is very similar to Shimmer, not only because it's purple/violet pink color, but also because of its healing and toxic properties. The conflict between these two stories increases even more since both of these characters are extremely powerful mob bosses. Even if Silco was the first to gain this power when he fell, Renata would certainly have fought to take his place. The opposite is also true. The existence of the two with their established stories inevitably ends up in conflict, which is terrible. Because even though they were born from the same idea, both characters are pretty cool in their own way. Most likely this conflict will be fixed with some very firm adjustments to Renata's story. It's worth remembering that Renata as a champion was ready for release long before her official date, and what delayed her release was precisely Arcane, and has been stated several times. Arcane was not made to be canon. It was just a very well-made series that intended to have its own community, taking elements from Runeterra and working with them in different ways and with different impacts, more suitable for mainstream media and not at all focused on the hardcore League fans, in a situation where Arcane and Runeterra remained as two different communities of the same world, basically alternative timelines. Silco and Renata could work perfectly, each having their importance in their own world, which is not the case. Moving on, we have Twitch.
They are the plague.
He's a complicated situation because the first question we ask is, what even is Twitch now? In his story, we're told that he's a rat who experienced a mutation and transformed into a humanoid creature. And that's it. The complication with Twitch comes much more from the Arcane fans than from the story we already have from him. It wasn't just a few people who believed that Twitch had already shown up in the series, whether it was the rat that was modified by Shimmer or the short guy with glasses, who we even see becoming a follower of Victor. But he was confirmed not to be in the show. Luckily, his case is very simple to develop, especially in Zon that already has several characters with animal characteristics without any explanation, but who are normally accepted by the viewers, since most of them already expected similar figures in a fantasy universe. Keeping in line with the animals, we have Warwick/Vander.
The city is my hunting ground.
Before Arcane, Warwick's past had no importance whatsoever, at least the part of his more recent story. For those who aren't familiar, even in an older story, like dude prehistoric times, Warwick had been Sin's teacher, and he was after Soraka's heart, but that's already an obscure part of the lore's past. Now when we go back to the current Warwick, we're talking about an alchemical experiment that creates a chimera with traits of various creatures that had a simply generic past that only existed to fill up some space. And Vander changed a lot of that. If its past used to be unimportant, Arcane transformed that and made sure to rub it in our face. We were introduced to Vander before Warwick, and since Arcane broke through the bubble and was many people's first experience with the Runeterra, that's the experience that really solidified his character. During Arcane, we start to like him and then fall in love with Vander and his personality, only for all of that to be completely taken away from us when the series does its time skip and remains absent until the first season. It's important to remember that for most of Arcane's first season, Vander was presumably dead, though we theorized about the possibility of him being Warwick. Most people who were already familiar with Runeterra's old lore were able to connect the dots and realize this before the end of the season basically confirmed that Vander was Warwick. But that basically is very important, because no one could say with absolute and total certainty that Vander was Warwick's past self, mainly because it was very possible that Riot would make narrative shifts and turns. Then the second season came and we had several really messed up moments with Vander and his transition to Warwick, and we could see even more brutally the man being erased and giving away only to the creature. And at the end of Arcane, Warwick was still a different creature, undergoing changes that could lead him to become a champion we know in League of Legends. As far as that, Riot just needs to present these changes for the character's entire arc to be concluded. Moving on, we have another creature. We have Zack.
Let's bounce.
The story we have says he's the product of a toxic spill that flowed through the Chemtech pipe and accumulated in an isolated cave in the slump of Zon. And despite his humble origins, Zack stopped being just any sludge and became a sentient being who lives in the city's pipes and occasionally emerges to help out the folks. It's a very small and isolated story, as it doesn't interact with any other League champion. Part of Zack's story involves the Kim Barons and an alchemy that exists in Runeterra's stories pre-Arcane, but which we didn't see develop in Arcane itself. Either way, since his story is very isolated and caricatural, it's very easy for Riot to fix him and connect his story to Runeterra after Arcane. They won't even need to mess up much with the character's core. Moving on, we have Ziggs.
Hey, where'd that bomb go?
Yordles are one of the most complicated cases in all of pre-Arcane Runeterra. I'm not gonna get into Ziggs and Heimer's comic book story here because even that can't be recycled and reused. Perhaps depicting a long time ago when Heimer didn't have all the recognition he has today. Either way, Ziggs' stories boils down to Yordle plus explosions that saves some Zon professors, which leads him to being accepted into the Piltover Academy. But an interesting chapter of his story is where he relates to Jinx. Obviously with her pre-Arcane version, where the two had a very funny relationship, where Ziggs realizing she was too crazy for him, and her believing that Ziggs was just a figment of her imagination. And remember when I said Yordles are one of the most complicated cases in pre-Arcane Runeterra? That's because Yordles were mystical creatures and in many cases were considered urban legends, which contributed to Jinx believing that Ziggs was just a creation of her insane and extremely fertile mind. When we bring it up to post-Arcane reality, this whole story either falls apart or opens up space for many events to occur during the time Vi was imprisoned and Jinx became increasingly insane. Zig's story doesn't need to be completely redone, but some continuity adjustments can make him important in Jinx's undocumented growth, especially before the final season, that is, during the period where she hadn't taken control of her insanity. Moving on, we have Zeri.
Do or die, I'm all in!
And her story is in a very similar situation to Renata's. Although Zeri herself has her launch problems, with a character in Valorant and in another in Legends of Runeterra being basically the same person. Putting that aside, Zeri's story connects with Echo's, and to some people's despair, it was a story that had one of its goals to give him a romantic partner. And after the Time Bomb event, that simply had no possibility of being accepted by the community anymore. It's easier for people to accept that in the current timeline, Echo and Jinx won't be able to have the happiness of a couple, than to accept that Zeri could be Echo's new love interest. And to complicate things even further, in her story, Zeri saves Echo's parents. Yes, the same parents who don't exist in Arcane. And even in the alternative reality, Benzo occupies the space of a parental figure. And with these elements removed, Zeri loses a lot of support for her story, which would have to be rewritten to make sense with a more experienced Echo, without parents and who maintains a passion for Jinx, even if it can't be reciprocated. Another attempt is to try to insist on a couple with Echo. Leave in the comments what you think of Echo and Zeri instead of Jinx. And finally, to close with Zaun, we have Singed.
How about a drink?
And here things get completely out of control. Not because of Singed himself, his pre-Arcane story had interesting elements that were skillfully improved or removed. But the big problem is the importance Singed had in the little inside job he did for Noxus in the war against Ionia. As many already know, the next Runeterra series will take place in Noxus, and for those who aren't familiar with the story outside of Arcane, the next series should show the way that Singed affects the lives and stories of many characters. In some cases, these characters have a history so conditioned by what Singed does that when he's removed from the equation, we have a huge hole that forces them to be completely rewritten. A very important character in the story of Singed and other Noxus champions is Emistan, who simply doesn't exist in Arcane. Although it's easy to bring this character to Runeterra after Arcane, Singed influence in a worldwide lore makes him one of the most complicated cases to rewrite. Arcane heavily modified Singed, giving him depth to a character who was previously just a caricature, a mad scientist without any mention of a daughter or motivations. I'd say if Arcane has a winner, his name is Corrin, Revik, or Singed. At the end of Arcane, he achieves his goal, which he spent decades and an entire series pursuing. He manages to bring his daughter back to life. However, if this daughter didn't exist originally, we have a huge problem that only a complete reformulation of its lore can solve. Perhaps the most complicated part of adapting the pre-Arcane story to after Arcane is fitting all of the important events into chronology. Transforming Singed into Corrin Revek is a massive change to the lore, one that makes Echo's game conversions effectively obsolete. After all, in this game, we do meet Corrin, but we are talking about a story where Echo has his parents and many things are completely different from what existed before and even after Arcane. Although the unification of Singed was very cool and made him a more interesting and profound character in general, good luck to whoever has to clean up this mess. With that, we finally finished the main regions where Arcane takes place, so let's move on to the next one. But first, if you watched this far, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Man, this video was a ton of work. So much information, a huge video to edit, and it was super hard. So if you enjoyed this and want to see more, subscribing is a free way to support the channel. And if you're willing to do a bit more, consider becoming a member. There are several cool benefits like getting early access to videos and being able to choose the theme of a video. Nothing better than heading straight to the region that will be the next Riot series, which, besides Piltover and Zaun, was the most explored region in Arcane. Luckily, the Arcane revamp seems to affect Noxus on a much smaller scale in the region itself, and since we're currently focusing on this region, perhaps some solutions will come faster than we imagine. However, this doesn't mean that Noxus will escape the lore disintegration ray that Arcane unleashed. Let's start with Swain.
I have seen this place. A vision. A battle.
Perhaps some of you didn't know Bald Swain before his rework. This rework was a part of a surreal modification and deepening of Noxus and its champions. Swain's story stands on its own without Arcane, and in many points doesn't conflict with Arcane Modified. Even so, the narrative direction for Noxus ends up touching on many important points of Swain's story. For those who started to get Runeterra with Arcane, the ravens we saw throughout the series seemed like just a stylistic and narrative device. But those who were already familiar with the world of Runeterra found themselves constantly thinking that these ravens were were linked to Swain, and at the end of the series, it becomes clear that this was correct. However, this opens up another question about when in Swain's history all of this happens. Are these ravens simply from Rom, who is Swain's demon, before he makes a pact with him? Or are they Swain's using Rom's power after the pact? In Swain's story, there are two very important moments, one following the other. The first is his battle in Navoria on the continent of Ionia, a failed Noxian campaign that completely reshaped the Empire, leading to its great general being deposed and much happening everywhere Noxus touched. In this first moment, Swain not only loses a battle, but has his arm severed by an Ionian girl. The second moment occurs when Swain returns to Noxus and ends up delving into the mysteries and secrets of the Immortal Bastion, to emerge from there with a new arm and demonic power. And then we have some questions. When in this Arcane changed Runeterra, does this Ionian invasion happen? What is Sin's relationship in this new story? And how does this fit into Sin's chronology and a part of his power chess game, transitioning from a pawn to one of the most important pieces? And the answer to these questions may end up redefining and reformulating Swain's story so that everything fits perfectly. Moving on, we have Riven.
My spirit is not lost.
This character is perhaps one of the ones whose story is most indirectly affected by Arcane, starting with the fact that she's gifted by her runic blade by the Borum Darkwill himself, a blade enchanted by LeBlanc herself. This already shows that the understanding of the timeline of the invasion of Ionia is extremely important, even if we just want to understand when Riven receives the sword. After receiving her weapon, she is sent to Ionia as a part of the invasion, and it is there that she has countless battles, though the last one is the most important of all, as it is the battle that practically defines her as a character and shapes her destiny. In this battle, Riven's unit is given a mission to escort another band that needs to pass through Navori. Because of this, the leader of her war band, Imistan, brings up a Zonite alchemist who was eager to test a new type of weapon, which was being carried in wagons in very fragile jars. During a confrontation, Riven and the band are stranded with this cargo, surrounded by Ionian warriors. Riven asks Imistan for help, but the response she receives is a flaming arrow that hits the wagon, causing the jars inside to explode with a chemical fireball, spreading and causing a painful and terrible death, with no distinction between Ionians and Noxians. The only thing that saves Riven from following this fate is her magic wind sword, which ends up protecting her from the entire explosion and chemical clouds. After this, she decides to break her sword, taking it to Elder Suma, who is a master of the wind technique. She abandons the sword and leaves, and the Elder in turn destroys the sword but dies in the process, which causes someone else to take the blame for it, while any consequences for Riven herself take a while to appear. There are still repercussions, which lead to a sequence of tales that deal with her story, such as Confessions of a Broken Blade, and even Sisterhood of War. Moving on, we have Urgot.
The weak are condemned.
Well, technically Urgot is much more linked to the Zon region than to Noxus in its current story, but Urgot originated from Noxus, so we'll talk about him here. He was Borum's Darkwill's executioner, and was sent to Zon in a move that allowed for the coup to happen in Noxus, which removed Borum and put the Triferix in his place. In Arcane, we don't see any mention at any point of a prisoner similar to Urgot, but more importantly, the entire corrupt structure that leads him to being imprisoned and used for an inhumane labor seems to not exist in Arcane. I know you might look at this Shimmer production line and think it's inhumane, and you're right, but what happens to Urgot goes a bit beyond that line, which is already terrible. So imagine how inhumane the situation is. If Borum's fall happens before Arcane, Urgot should already be there, and it happens after Arcane, then the number of things that we need to change escalates absurdly, which makes it easier to literally throw away these characters and stories and start from scratch. And finally, in Noxus, we have LeBlanc.
The best lies are beautiful.
At first, LeBlanc and her perfect plans that always fail seem to have nothing to do with Arcane, until it starts to look like everything that happens in Arcane was a part of yet another one of these perfect plans. A teaser for the continuation of her story after Arcane, shown at the ending of this year animation, showed us a LeBlanc joined by a rejuvenated Vladimir, with them clearly stating that what happened in Piltover/Zon was their doing. This cinematic was not only a redemption for her fans, but also a huge problem in the continuity in this pre- and post-Arcane relationship. In the old lore, it's LeBlanc who encourages Borum Darkwill to invade Ionia in the search of immortality. This invasion defines the history of many characters from both Noxus and Ionia, so LeBlanc after Arcane has a lot to explain, since the things that her plans end up unleashing, and maybe even her story itself, needs a revision. And with that, we're done with Noxus. Let's move on with the next region.
Welcome to the rice field.
I've already mentioned it several times in the Noxus section. If you thought Noxus was heavily affected by a region that barely even shows up in Arcane, then get ready for Ionia. Ionia is deeply affected by the Noxian invasion, and it's so important that it will define most of the characters we know from that region. Noxus's invasion completely redefined Ionia itself. Before it happened, Ionia practically had no political divisions, no state, municipality, village, or hamlet boundaries. Nothing like that. Everyone just lived wherever they wanted. They might have had their squabbles here and there, but they mostly lived in harmony with the land. Okay, for the first champion, let's talk about Akali.
Let's make this quick.
A lot of her story isn't directly related to Noxus, focusing more on the Kinku Order, which does have some relation, but probably not enough to impact the character. Perhaps Arcane's biggest impact on Akali is a piece of her story that was left on a hook for future use, where her training partner, Faye, ends up losing a leg. For years, many people theorized that this character, introduced us in the short story The Bow and the Kunai, would appear as the new champion, most likely with a prosthetic leg. And if you thought of Zahn, you hit the nail right on the head. The story doesn't point to this at all, but in the community, it makes a lot of sense, with new characters often being considered, like Faye, becoming a champion and returning, whether to forgive or take revenge from Akali accountable for her mistakes. But none of that has happened so far, and with all the characters to work on, besides the more than 170 champions in League, maybe Faye is just another detail forgotten by Riot. Going to the next champion, we have Irelia.
Peace requires 2 participants.
I have a question for you all. In the Riven versus Irelia matchup, do you rush damage or CDR? This question might not make any sense to those who only know Arcane, but for those who play League of Legends, it definitely does. And they've certainly faced this dilemma in their games. Irelia is a beloved character by the community, and everyone knows her, whether they hate her or love her a lot. She's popular, and although her story isn't as important to the part of the community, her importance to the history of Ionia and Noxus is extreme. We've talked a lot about the invasion of Ionia, how much it changed this region and its characters. We've also talked about how what happens in Ionia during this invasion will impact Noxus and consequently Piltover and all of Runeterra. Through all of this, Irelia manages to be immune to many changes in her narrative, but she still plays a fundamental role in something that connects to many other stories. This is because Irelia is the young woman who severs Swain's arm. It might seem like this has little impact at first, but when you understand that this happens because of the Noxian invasion and how Noxus was decimating the Ionians, even using powerful chemical weapons created by Singed, we have to analyze this a little bit more. In her lore, Irelia rediscovers a forgotten martial art that was preserved in the form of a dance with veils. This creates a huge impact in Ionia, and we see this impact culminating in the second invasion of Ionia. Wait, a second invasion? We don't even have the first one resolved and fitted into the chronology. What's this about a second invasion? Well, when Irelia severed Swain's arm, she directly impacted the end of the first Noxian invasion, sending him back to Noxus to find the demon, attack the Empire, overthrow Borum Darkwill, end Noxus's expansionist campaign, and allow the second invasion, which we saw in the animation, to happen at some point in the future. How much of this is related, impacting, or being impacted by the search for the Arcane that happens in Arcane? Well, without getting into crazy theories about strings being pulled behind the scenes, we already have immense consequences for the story as a whole, so it's better not to get into those theories for now. Moving on, we have one of the most beloved characters by the community, one that I personally have never seen anyone dislike, and that's Jhin.
The stage is set.
He has a very solid story in Ionia before and during the Noxian invasion. Therefore, this part of his story was untouched by Arcane and needs no work at all. But some things changed after the invasion. Jhin was eventually freed from his prison in Tula and began to be used as a weapon by powerful people in Ionia. In other words, the end of the Noxian invasion resulted in powerful people in Ionia freeing a serial killer as a tool for revenge. Furthermore, Jhin later passed through Piltover, even having a confrontation with Camille and soldiers from the Furrows clan, who, as we mentioned back in Piltover, are completely out of sync with Runeterra after Arcane. But anyway, moving on, we have Karma.
Heart and mind as one.
She's a character loved by many people and super important to the lore, but incredibly neglected by Riot, with almost no updates or story appearances, except in 2 animations. In the first, she almost gets dominated by Viego, which makes no sense, but whatever. In the second, she shows up to save Irelia and joins some folks to fight Swain and the Noxian army in what seems to be the second invasion. Come to think of it, maybe she's not so neglected after all. She even got a legendary Spirit Blossom skin. Anyway, her main story is linked to the first invasion when she ends up taking a completely different path from all of her predecessors, who always valued peace and harmony. In other words, the first invasion messed with her a lot, shaping her story and her actions, while the second invasion shows her returning to the fight to save Ionia. For Karma, these 2 wars are the most impacted by Arcane's storyline. The answer to the timelines of the 2 invasions could change her story a lot, especially since, as far far as we know, these timelines are closely linked to the history of Piltover, Noxus, Singed, and the chemical weapons that decimated the Ionians. For the next character, we have Arcane.
The shadows reveal weakness.
Many people don't know or forget that the fact Sheeta Kane was born in Noxus and was a child soldier who was sent in the first invasion of Ionia by Borum Darkwill. Eventually, Zed found him on the battlefield, took him to the Order of Shadow, and trained him to be a kind of successor and weapon against Noxus. By now, we're starting to see a pattern. Without knowing post-Arcane version of the Noxian invasion, a lot is left up in the air. Hopefully for Kane and his fans, his new story won't involve Arcane or mess up his relationship with the Darkened Scythe Rost. Our next character is another Yordle, Kinnan.
Big targets are the best. There's more to aim at.
You might think Heimerdinger is old, but Kinnan is another beast entirely. He's recorded over 6,000 years of age, and his story is practically the entire history of the Kinku Order, which includes Shin and Akali, and in the past, even Zed. In a very similar attitude to Heimer's, typical of a non-human character who can't understand the human perspective, Kinnan chooses not to oppose the first Noxian invasion, and guides the members of his order to another place. But in the second invasion, he decides to help, which is why he appears in the cinematic. I think you get it now, right? Kinku, Noxian invasion, Singed, Arcane, etc. Moving on, we have Lee Sin.
Only I can endure the dragon's fury.
For about half of his history, Lee has a lot of independence and freedom regarding Arcane. However, the moment that he returns to Ionia with Udyr and sees the Noxian invasion happening, we can immediately tell that this story enters the box of stories that Arcane messed with. We don't know many of his feats during the invasion, other than the fact that he decimated invaders using the power of the dragon spirit. It is true that he lost his eyes because of this, but it's not like it's that important to the character. I'm obviously joking. Lee Sin's whole thing is that he's blind. The invasion of Ionia is essential to the character we know. It formed him, and it was responsible for one of the most iconic characteristics. Therefore, the resolution of this dilemma is very important for this popular character. Our next character is one of my favorites, Master Yi.
Let us begin.
Like the other characters from Ionia, Yi, since Master is just a title, is involved with the Noxian invasion. However, he is dragged into the conflict when his entire village and the Wuju monastery were decimated by the Noxians, exterminated by a chemical fire that no metal could stop. By now you must know where this fire comes from, and all the problems its source causes for this very important moment in Master Yi's history. Yes, I'm gonna keep saying Master Yi. I only said Yi to clarify his title. As a side point, Wukong eventually finds Master Yi and becomes his first apprentice. So, the invasion also technically affects Wukong.
Technique is for lightweights.
Alright, for the next champion, let's take a look at Set. In the first lines of Set's story, we see that he was born from the relationship of an Ionian Vastaya with a Noxian human. Even though Set has one of the worst stories in all of League of Legends, it's already clear that his origin is entrenched in the story Arcane has modified. More importantly, Set's father remains unknown to this day. One part of the community theorizes that it's Draven, another part swears it's an arena fighter character from Legends of Runeterra, and some even bet it's Xin Zhao. In any case, the extremely confusing timeline means Set's paternity remains undefined. The fact that Arcane can even mess up a story as shallow as Set's really shows how far-reaching the show's effects really are. Consider this a crazy fact. If you ever try your absolute hardest to figure out roughly how old Set is, the most logical conclusion is that he's about 14 years old. Rioters have already said that that's not his age, but there's no way around it. As long as the story and timeline remained screw up, our best chance of guessing his Set's chronological age is a laughable 14 years old. Moving on, let's talk about Yasuo.
Justice. That's a pretty word.
He's another character whose story Arcane completely messed up. During the Noxian invasion, Yasuo was a sword apprentice whose job was to guard Elder Suma. However, when he saw the chaos happening, he abandoned the Elder to fight in the battle, thinking his talents could be better used elsewhere. Unfortunately for him, this is where another relevant champion comes into play. Remember Riven? Well, after witnessing the terror on the battlefield, Riven sought a way to destroy her sword, believing it was cursed. When she found Elder Suma, she asked him to destroy the sword, which he was able to do, at the cost of his own life. When the sword was destroyed, the powerful magic within the sword exploded, killing the old man. When Yasuo returned from the battlefield, he found his master dead, with wounds made from what looked like wind magic, the very same magic Yasuo had learned to manipulate. Although the death was actually Riven's fault, all signs pointed to Yasuo's interference. As a result, he was cast out, hunted as a fugitive, and eventually confronted by his brother, who actually believed that he was the Elder's killer. Yasuo's lore ends with him on the run, forced into exile. Though Yasuo's connection to Arcane might not seem to exist, we can actually see how Riven's story, which was in turn influenced by Singed, ended up directly changing both his and his brother Yone's stories. And since I mentioned him, let's talk about Yone.
Honor once bound me above all else.
Yasuo's older brother fought in the war against Nexus, but his brother, who should have been guarding Elder Suma, left his post, leading to the Elder's death. Since the fatal wounds seemed to be made out of wind magic, Yasuo's specialty, Yone accused him of murder, especially while hunting Yasuo. Yone ends up fighting him. Yasuo comes out on top, not only winning, but killing Yone at the end. And this is where things get complicated. It's thanks to Yasuo's failure to protect Elder Suma, combined with all of his irresponsibility in life, that Yone, upon dying, can't simply rest. All this weight tormenting Yone causes an Azakana to approach him in what seems like the spirit world. Yone confronts this Azakana and apparently takes part of its power, managing to return to the regular world. Basically, if Ionia hadn't been invaded by Nexus, Singed wouldn't have unleashed his surreal chemical weapons on the people of Ionia. Without that devastation, Riven wouldn't have been horrified and traumatized, which wouldn't have resulted in her seeking to destroy her sword. If she hadn't wanted to destroy her sword, she would have never found Elder Suma. Without Riven, he wouldn't have broken the sword and died in the process, and Yasuo wouldn't have become a fugitive because of his death. Therefore, Yasuo and Yone wouldn't have fought, and Yone wouldn't have died and turned into this strange creature. Anyway, let's move to Zed.
Balance is a fool's master.
By now you've understood that Zed and Shin, the Order of the Shadow, and the Kinku are extremely affected by the post-Arcane continuity, but specifically, Zed only exists as we know him thanks to this invasion. Although he was already discontent with the Kinku's direction, it was only when the Noxians invaded and the Kinku refused to participate that Zed decided to invade the catacombs of his temple to find the black box with the living shadows, leading to his emergence as the edgy anti-hero ninja that everyone knows and loves. With his own methods and ideals, he fights against Nexus, but he also ends up fighting against many Ionians. As a result, he never truly becomes a hero, since for him, the ends justify the means, even if the means are stealing the magic of the Vestaya and killing all who resist. But that's for another video, and with that, we finished the Ionian characters. However, there's still a bit more to cover. It's extremely important to mention that thanks to the extreme bloodshed that happened during the invasion of Ionia, the annual spiritual bloom stopped occurring, as if the path had become clogged with the number of arriving souls. The fact that the spirit blossom didn't happen ends up impacting many characters and many events in Ionia, from the Yasuo and Yone animation, which shows up in the first spirit blossom to happen after the war, to Lilia's story, and even a few other things about Ionian culture, but those things would fit better in another video. Anyways, we've gone through the history of Piltover, Zaun, Nexus, and Ionia. We could have gone through even more regions like Ikathia, Shurima, and even Ishtal, but that would make the video unnecessarily long. They would be feudal things, so to speak. For the record, I don't hate Arcane. After all, Arcane was a wonderful work that managed to bring so many people to the world of Runeterra. Still, it's undeniable that many stories after Arcane are in crisis, with an urgent need for a revision, correction, and in some cases, a complete overhaul. I'm not blaming Arcane for this. The main reason this happened was Arcane's success, which went beyond every expectation, breaking through the League bubble and reaching a worldwide audience. Furthermore, the history of Runeterra has already gone through several moments where major parts of the story were completely discarded. After all, Renekton is no longer a mutant crocodile living in Zaun's sewers. Still, when Arcane emerged, Runeterra was at a point where its history had become something truly valuable and was being actively developed. Even if it was slow, it was done in a way that established a core continuity with respect and attention to detail. Before ending the video, for those of you who've watched this far, I want to talk about the two bonus characters who are not from the regions I mentioned. The first is Udyr. It's during the Noxian invasion that Udyr joins Lee Sin and they defeat many Noxians together. This is especially important because the result of this invasion was actually defined by a League of Legends match that happened many years ago. That's right. The conflict between Nexus and Ionia was defined by a League match, and this is still present in the League of Legends today, in a form of Ionian Boots of Lucidity. I bet you didn't know that, did you? And the other character is Talia. Even she, who is from Shurima, has had her story altered by Arcane. This is because when Yasuo becomes Talia's master, he was a wanderer, and it was he who teaches her to use her gift. So if Yasuo had never been exiled, he wouldn't have found Talia, and she wouldn't have known how to use her magic. But that's basically it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.